It happens at 18,000 feet. 1 second, the cockpit is routine. The next, something punches through the canopy glass with a sound nobody can explain. Not the crack of flak, not the rip of machine gun fire. Something else. Lieutenant James Morrison feels it before he sees it. A sting, sharp, burning. And then the world starts to dissolve. His vision does not go black. That would almost be easier. Instead, it melts. The instruments blur into soup. The horizon bleeds into sky. Depth collapses into flatness. And in a B-17 bomber over enemy territory in August of 1943, that is not an injury. That is a countdown to death. But here is what makes this story different from every other survival story you have heard. This mission was not supposed to exist. The flight logs were altered. The crew was told to never speak of it. And 40 years later, when parts of this story finally surfaced, the military still refused to explain why. Because what hit Morrison that day was not standard ammunition. The object they pulled from his flight helmet was sent to Wright Field for analysis. The report came back with 2 words: unknown composition. And then the report disappeared. That should bother you. Because if a pilot gets injured by enemy fire, you write it up, you document it, you learn from it. But when a pilot gets hit by something the military cannot identify, and then that entire mission gets scrubbed from the record, you have to ask a different question. What were they carrying? And who did not want it to reach Allied hands? The aircraft is called Shadow Dancer. It is a B-17F out of the 8th Air Force, and on paper, it is returning from a bombing raid over Stuttgart. Routine, standard, forgettable. But Shadow Dancer did not go to Stuttgart that day. It went to the Swiss border, neutral territory, and it picked up cargo that required an OSS agent on board. The Office of Strategic Services, the organization that would become the CIA. They do not send agents on routine bombing runs. They send agents when something matters more than the lives of everyone on the plane. So when Morrison gets hit and his vision starts failing, the OSS agent, a major named Ross, does not order a bailout. He does not authorize a divert to the nearest emergency field. He pulls rank and gives an order that violates every pilot safety protocol in the book. He says, "This aircraft will return to base. 9 men, 1 half-blind pilot, and cargo so valuable that someone just tried to kill them for it." Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about what you are about to hear. This story was buried for decades. The crew signed non-disclosure agreements under threat of court-martial. Most of them took the truth to their graves. But in 2015, Morrison's son found his father's diary. Parts of it were declassified, not all of it, just enough to start asking the right questions. And that is what we do here at World War II Uncovered. We find the stories they did not teach you in school, the missions that got erased, the moments that were too strange, too classified, or too inconvenient for the official narrative. If that is the kind of history you want, go ahead and hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the stories we cover do not show up in your average documentary. They show up in declassified files, veteran testimonies, and the things people only whisper about at reunions. Alright, back to Shadow Dancer. Because Morrison is now flying a bomber he can barely see. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Chen, is staring at him, waiting for the call, waiting for Morrison to admit he cannot do this, waiting for him to hand over control. But Morrison does not hand over control, not yet, because handing over control means admitting something worse than injury. It means admitting that this mission, whatever it really is, might fail. And failure is not an option, not with Major Ross sitting 10 feet behind him, hand on his sidearm, making it very clear that this cargo is going home, no matter what. So, Morrison blinks. He tries to force his vision back into focus. He tries to read the altimeter, the airspeed indicator, the artificial horizon, but the instruments are melting into each other. The numbers swim, the needles drift. And the worst part is this: he knows his body is lying to him. He knows his brain is filling in gaps that are not really there. He knows that what he thinks he sees and what is actually in front of him are two different things. And in aviation, that gap kills you. The question is not whether Morrison can see well enough to fly. The question is whether he can see well enough to land. Because getting home is not one action. It is a chain: navigation, communication, approach, alignment, flare, touchdown. Every single step requires vision. Every single step requires certainty. And Morrison has neither. But here is the thing nobody tells you about that flight. Morrison is not the hero of this story. He is just the one holding the stick. The real story is what happens when 9 men realize their survival depends on something the Air Force never officially trained them for. A protocol that does not exist in any manual. A procedure so extreme that when it finally leaked decades later, the military labeled it tactically inadvisable and refused to comment further. They called it Protocol Lazarus. And, if you have never heard of it, that is because you were never supposed to. Let me tell you what they were really doing that day. August 17, 1943. Most B-17 seconds from the 8th Air Force are hitting industrial targets deep in Germany. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, railway junctions, the kind of targets that make sense on a mission report. The kind of targets that justify sending bombers into flak-heavy airspace. Shadow Dancer is not on that list. Shadow Dancer lifts off from RAF Bassingbourn at 0530 hours with a flight plan that says Stuttgart. But 20 minutes into the flight, navigator Lieutenant Hayes gets a sealed envelope from Major Ross. Inside is a new set of coordinates. No explanation, just numbers. And when Hayes plots them, his pencil stops halfway across the map. The Swiss border. Switzerland is neutral, has been since the war started. Flying into Swiss airspace is a violation of international law. Getting caught means internment. Your aircraft gets impounded. Your crew gets locked up for the duration of the war. The Allied command does not risk that unless the payoff is worth more than a bomber and 9 lives. So, what is worth that risk? Hayes does not ask. You do not ask Major Ross questions. You can tell by the way he sits in the back of the aircraft, hand resting on a leather satchel cuffed to his wrist, that asking questions is a good way to end up in a very different kind of trouble. Ross is OSS, Office of Strategic Services. They do not do bombing raids. They do espionage, sabotage, extraction. The kind of work that does not get written up in after-action reports. And Ross is not alone. There is a second man in the back. No name, no rank insignia, no dog tags that anyone can see. He does not speak to the crew, does not make eye contact, just sits near the cargo bay with his hands folded, staring at nothing. Morrison sees him during pre-flight and asks Ross who he is. Ross says, "He is not your concern." That is all. Now, here is what we know from declassified OSS documents. In the summer of 1943, the Allies are running a network of covert operations out of Switzerland. Smuggling routes, safe houses, dead drops. Switzerland is neutral, but it is also porous. Information flows through Zurich and Geneva like water. Nazi defectors, resistance contacts, black market dealers. If you need something moved quietly from Axis territory to Allied hands, you go through Switzerland. And sometimes, what you are moving is not a document. It is a person. Shadow Dancer crosses into Swiss airspace at 0700 hours. No radio contact, no clearance. They drop to 5,000 feet and follow a river valley that keeps them below radar. It is precision flying, dangerous flying. The kind of flying that makes your fuel margins razor thin. Morrison holds the aircraft steady while Chen watches for landmarks. A barn, a church steeple, a bend in the river, anything that matches the map Hayes is holding. Then they see it, a field, freshly mowed, and at the north end, a single truck with its headlights flashing in a pattern. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long. Hayes says, "That is it." Morrison does not land. You do not land a B-17 inches afield unless you are on fire or out of options. Instead, he makes a low pass at 90 knots, while the ball turret gunner, Sergeant Kowalski, drops a cargo chute out the waist hatch. Attached to the chute is a rope ladder, and as Shadow Dancer roars overhead, 2 figures sprint from the truck, grab the ladder, and climb. 30 seconds. That is how long the pickup takes. 30 seconds of Morrison holding the aircraft straight and level at stall speed, while 2 strangers climb a rope ladder into the belly of a bomber. Chen is counting altitude. Hayes is counting seconds. And Morrison is flying by feel, because one wrong input, and the whole aircraft drops out of the sky. The figures make it inside. Kowalski hauls them up and slams the hatch. Ross moves to the cargo bay. The crew hears voices. Low, urgent. One of the voices is speaking German. Then the voices stop, and Ross returns to his seat. His face is blank. He does not explain. He does not debrief. He just looks at Morrison and says, "Get us home." That is it. Now, Morrison does not know who those 2 people are. He does not know what they are carrying. He does not know if they are defectors or spies or scientists or something else entirely. All he knows is that Ross has a satchel cuffed to his wrist, and now there are 2 more passengers in the cargo bay, and the whole operation just went from unauthorized to catastrophic if anyone finds out. But someone does find out, because 40 minutes later, at 18,000 feet over occupied France, 3 aircraft appear on the horizon. They are not Messerschmitts, they are not Focke-Wulfs, they are something the crew has never seen before. Sleek, fast, no markings. And they are closing the gap at a speed that should not be possible for 1943 technology. Chen spots them first. He says, "Skipper, we have company, 3 o'clock high." Morrison looks, squints, his eyes are good, 20/20 vision. But even he cannot identify the silhouette. He says, "What the hell are those?" Hayes checks his aircraft recognition cards. Nothing matches. He says, "I do not know." Ross moves to the window, stares, and for the first time since takeoff, his face changes. Not fear, something colder. He says, "They are not ours." Chen says, "Are they Luftwaffe?" Ross does not answer. He just moves back to the cargo bay and starts talking fast to the 2 passengers. Morrison cannot hear what they are saying, but he hears the tone. Urgent, tense. Like something just went very wrong. The 3 aircraft split formation. 1 high, 1 level, 1 low. It is not a standard attack pattern. It is surgical, coordinated, like they know exactly what they are doing. And then, the level aircraft fires. Not a burst. A single shot. Precise. Controlled. And that shot punches through the cockpit canopy and hits Lieutenant James Morrison in the side of the head. Not a killing blow. If it were, this story would be over. But the impact is enough to crack his helmet, enough to shred the skin above his right temple, and enough to send something foreign into his skull. Not shrapnel. Not a bullet fragment. Something else. Something that starts breaking down his optic nerve in real time. Morrison does not pass out. He wishes he did. Instead, he feels his vision start to ripple. Like looking through water. The instruments blur. The horizon splits into 2 overlapping images. And the pain is not sharp. It is deep, grinding. The kind of pain that tells you something inside is breaking. Chen is shouting. Hayes is shouting. Kowalski is yelling about enemy contact, and Ross is screaming into the cargo bay, "Stay down! Do not move!" But Morrison is not listening to any of them. He is listening to his body, and his body is telling him that he has minutes, maybe less, before his vision is gone completely, which means he has minutes to decide what happens next. Does he bail out? Does he hand control to Chen? Does he try to make it home? And that is when Ross appears behind him, leans close, and says something that changes everything. He says, "You are going to land this aircraft, Lieutenant. That is an order. Because if you do not, a lot of people are going to die. Not just on this plane. A lot of people." Morrison turns his head, tries to focus on Ross's face. Fails. He says, "I cannot see." Ross says, "Then you are going to learn how to fly blind." A moment in every crisis where your brain catches up to reality, where the shock wears off, and you realize this is actually happening. For Morrison, that moment comes about 10 seconds after Ross walks away. His right eye is useless, completely gone. The left one is holding on, but barely. Everything has a halo around it. Depth perception is a guess. And every time his heart beats, his vision pulses like a dying light bulb. Chen is already reaching for the controls. He says, "Jim, let me take it." Morrison does not let go. Not because he is brave, not because he is stubborn, because the second he lets go, he becomes a passenger. And passengers do not make decisions. Passengers do not control outcomes. Passengers just sit there and hope someone else gets it right. He says, "Not yet." Chen says, "You cannot see the panel." Morrison says, "I can see enough." That is a lie. But it is the kind of lie you tell when the truth is too expensive. Because the truth is this. If Morrison hands over control right now, Chen has to process the transfer, adjust his seat, recalibrate his mental model of the aircraft, and do all of that while 3 unidentified hostiles are still out there. Transition moments are when accidents happen. Transition moments are when people die. So Morrison keeps his hands on the yoke, keeps his feet on the rudder pedals, and starts doing the math. The hostile aircraft do not follow up. They do not circle back for another pass. They just peel off and disappear into the clouds like they were never there. Which is strange. If they wanted to shoot down a bomber, they had the position, they had the speed, they had the shot. but they only fired once, one precise hit. And then they left. Hayes says, "Did we just get warning shot?" Ross does not answer. He is back in the cargo bay, talking in rapid German to the two passengers. Morrison can hear the tone shifting. It is not interrogation. It is negotiation. Or maybe coordination. Hard to tell. But Ross is not acting like a man who just survived an attack. He is acting like a man who expected it. Kowalski climbs down from the ball turret. He says, "Skipper, you want me to plot a damage report?" Morrison says, "No, I want you up here." Kowalski stops. He says, "Sir?" Morrison says, "You are my eyes now. Tell me what the instruments say." That is when the crew realizes what is about to happen. Morrison is not handing over control. He is distributing it. He is turning the cockpit into a system where he is just one input among many. And if you know anything about how bombers were flown in World War II, you know that is not how it works. The pilot flies. The co-pilot assists. The crew manages their stations. There is a hierarchy, a chain of command. You do not run a cockpit like a democracy. But Morrison does not have a choice, because his injury just turned this into a different kind of problem. It is not about skill anymore. It is not about experience. It is about information flow. And right now, Morrison is losing access to the one thing every pilot needs: reliable data. Chen understands first. He says, "What do you need?" Morrison says, "Altitude and airspeed, constant updates. Do not wait for me to ask." Chen nods. He says, 12,000 feet, airspeed 160. Hayes moves closer. He says, "Heading?" Morrison says, "Give me a course home. Shortest route, no detours." Hayes unfolds his map. He says 270 degrees, direct to the channel. Morrison adjusts. The yoke feels wrong in his hands. He is flying by muscle memory now, by the vibration in the airframe, by the sound of the engines. But he can feel the aircraft responding. That is something. Not much, but something. Kowalski takes position behind Morrison's seat. He is staring at the instrument panel like it is a test he did not study for. He says, "Okay, oil pressure is green, engine temps are green, fuel is. We are going to be tight." Morrison says, "How tight?" Kowalski does some math in his head. He says, "If we hold this speed and this altitude, we have maybe 20 minutes of margin, maybe." Morrison says, "Then we hold this speed and this altitude." Chen says, 11,800 feet, airspeed 155. The rhythm starts to build. Chen calls numbers. Hayes calls headings. Kowalski watches the gauges. Morrison makes tiny corrections based on what they tell him. It is not elegant, it is not smooth, but it works. The aircraft stays level. The wings stay steady. And for the first time since the hit, Morrison feels like maybe, just maybe, they have a chance. Then Ross comes back. He sits down in the jump seat behind Chen and says, "We have a problem." Morrison does not look at him, cannot look at him. He says, "We have several." Ross says, "The cargo needs to reach Bassingbourn. Not a divert field, not an emergency strip. Bassingbourn. Do you understand?" Chen snaps. He says, "He is half blind. We are not making demands right now." Ross says, "I am not making a demand. I am clarifying priorities." Morrison cuts in. He says, "What is in the cargo bay, Major?" Ross pauses. Then he says, "Something that changes the war." Morrison says, "That is not an answer." Ross says, "It is the only answer you are getting." There is a silence. The engines drone. The air whistles through the hole in the canopy. And Morrison realizes something that makes his stomach drop. This is not about him. This is not about the crew. This is about whatever Ross pulled out of Switzerland. And Ross is willing to let 9 men die to protect it. Morrison says, "If I crash this aircraft, your cargo does not make it home either." Ross says, "Then do not crash." Chen looks like he wants to punch Ross in the face. Hayes looks like he wants to bail out. Kowalski is gripping the back of Morrison's seat so hard his knuckles are white, and Morrison is doing the only thing he can do. He is flying, blind, injured, and completely out of options. But here is the thing about impossible situations. Sometimes they force you to think differently. Sometimes they strip away all the protocols and procedures and training and leave you with one question. What actually matters? And for Morrison, what matters is this. He has 8 other men on this aircraft. He has a co-pilot who is good enough to land if Morrison cannot. He has a navigator who knows the route. He has a crew that trusts him. and he has just enough vision left to keep the aircraft stable until they figure out the next step. So he makes a decision. He says, "Chen, you are flying the approach." Chen blinks. He says, "What?" Morrison says, "When we get to Bassingbourn, you are taking controls. I will handle throttle and trim. You handle everything else." Chen says, "You are staying on the controls?" Morrison says, "I am not letting go of this aircraft, but I am not landing it either. You are." It is a compromise, a split responsibility model that should not work. But Morrison is betting that it will, because Chen knows how to land a B-17. He has done it dozens of times. What Chen does not have is the confidence to take control away from his pilot. But if Morrison gives it to him, that is different. That is an order. That is permission. Ross listens to this exchange, and for the first time, his expression softens, just slightly. He says, "That might actually work." Morrison says, "It has to." Chen looks at Hayes. Hayes looks at Kowalski. Kowalski looks at Morrison. And then, slowly, they all nod. Because what else are they going to do? Bail out over France and hope the resistance finds them before the Gestapo does? Crash land in a field and watch Ross execute them for compromising the mission? No. They are going home. All of them. With the cargo, with the mystery passengers, with whatever the hell this mission actually is. And they are going to do it as a crew. But first, they have to survive the next 2 hours. Because the channel is still 100 miles away. And Morrison's vision is getting worse. 14 minutes later, Morrison realizes he made a mistake. Not the decision to split control. That part is holding. Chen is solid. Hayes is feeding good information. Kowalski is watching the instruments like his life depends on it. Which it does. The mistake is simpler. Dumber. The kind of thing you do not think about until it is too late. He forgot to account for his own body. The human brain is not built for sustained partial vision. When one eye goes dark and the other one is fading, your brain does not just accept it. It fights. It tries to fill in the gaps. It guesses. It hallucinates. And somewhere over the French coast, Morrison's brain starts doing exactly that. He sees the altimeter needle move, except it does not move. Chen confirms they are steady at 11,000 feet, but Morrison sees the needle dropping. His hand twitches toward the yoke, starts to pull back. Chen feels the input and says, "Jim, we are level. You are seeing things." Morrison freezes. His hand is shaking. He says, "Say again?" Chen says, "You just tried to climb. We do not need to climb. We are on altitude." Morrison forces his hand to relax. He says, "Copy." But the damage is done. Because now Morrison knows his brain is lying to him. And if it is lying about the altimeter, what else is it lying about? The airspeed? The heading? The horizon? This is the part of the story no one talks about. The part where the injury stops being a physical problem and becomes a psychological one. Because Morrison is not just fighting his vision anymore. He is fighting his own perception of reality. And that is a fight you cannot win. You can only manage it. He says, "Chen, new rule. If I make an input you do not understand, call it out immediately." Chen says, "Roger that." Hayes says, "We are 10 miles from the coast. Once we cross, we are over the channel." Morrison says, "How long to Bassingbourn from there?" Hayes does the math. He says, 40 minutes, maybe less if we push airspeed. Kowalski says, "Fuel says we do not push airspeed." Morrison says, "Then we do not push airspeed." The minutes crawl. Morrison can feel his heartbeat in his skull. Each pulse makes his vision flicker. He tries closing his right eye completely. That helps, a little, but it also throws off his balance. Makes him feel tilted even when the aircraft is level. He opens it again, tries to focus on the blurry shapes in front of him. Fails. Chen says, "Crossing the coast now." Morrison feels the shift. Over land, there is texture. Fields, roads, towns. Over water, there is nothing, just gray. And for a pilot who cannot see well, that is almost a relief. Because there is nothing to misinterpret. No false landmarks. No phantom runways. Just empty space between them and England. Then Ross comes forward again. He does not sit this time. He stands between Morrison and Chen, one hand on each seat back, and says, "I need to tell you something." Morrison says, "Can it wait?" Ross says, "No." Chen glances at him, says, "Make it fast." Ross says, "The cargo. It is not just intelligence. It is a person, a scientist, German. He has information about a weapons program the Nazis are developing. Something that makes the Vone rocket look like a firework. If he does not make it to Bassingbourn, if he falls into the wrong hands, the entire trajectory of this war changes. Morrison does not respond immediately. He is processing. Finally, he says, "Who else knows he is on this aircraft?" Ross says, "Officially, no one. The pickup was off book. The mission does not exist, but someone knew. Someone sent those aircraft after us, which means someone is willing to kill to stop him from talking." Chen says, "You are saying we are still a target." Ross says, "I am saying we were always a target. The only question is whether they will try again before we land." Hayes turns around in his seat. He says, "And you are telling us this now because?" Ross says, "Because you need to know what you are protecting, and because if something happens to me, someone on this crew needs to know how to get him to the right people. Not just any intelligence officer, the right people." Morrison says, "Who are the right people?" Ross pulls a folded paper from his jacket. He hands it to Chen. He says, "If I do not walk off this aircraft, you give him this. He knows what to do with it." Chen takes the paper, does not open it. He says, "You think you are not walking off?" Ross says, "I think I have been in this line of work long enough to know when a mission goes bad. And this one went bad the second those aircraft showed up." There is something in his voice, not fear, resignation. Like he has already calculated the odds and accepted the outcome. Morrison does not like it. He says, "Major, if you are planning something stupid, do not." Ross almost smiles. He says, "I am not planning anything, Lieutenant. I am just being realistic. Now focus on flying. I will handle the rest." He walks back to the cargo bay. Morrison hears him talking to the scientist. Low, calm. What kind of tone you use when you are explaining something that cannot be changed. Chen says, "I do not like this." Morrison says, "Neither do I." Kowalski says, "Fuel is dropping faster than I want. We might have to reduce power." Morrison says, "How much margin does that cost us?" Kowalski says, 5 minutes, maybe 10. Morrison says, "Do it." Chen says, "You sure?" Morrison says, "If we run out of fuel before we land, none of this matters." Chen nods. He reaches for the throttle levers, pulls them back. The engine noise drops, the vibration changes, and the aircraft settles into a slower, steadier rhythm. It feels wrong, feels vulnerable, but it buys them time. Hayes says, "We are 20 miles from the English coast." Morrison says, "Once we cross, I want you on the radio. Let Bassingbourn know we are coming in with an injured pilot and priority cargo. Tell them to clear the main runway and have medical standing by." Hayes says, "What do I tell them about the cargo?" Morrison says, "Tell them Major Ross will explain on the ground. Do not give details." Hayes says, "Copy." The next 15 minutes are the longest of Morrison's life. Not because anything dramatic happens, because nothing happens. They just fly, steady, boring. The kind of flying that should be easy. But for Morrison, every second is a battle. His vision keeps phasing in and out. Sometimes he can see the instruments. Sometimes he cannot. Sometimes he thinks he sees another aircraft in the distance and has to ask Chen to confirm it is not there. Chen never hesitates. He just confirms, corrects, keeps Morrison grounded in reality. And slowly, Morrison starts to trust him. Not just as a co-pilot, as the person who is going to get them home. Then Hayes gets on the radio. He says, "Bassingbourn Tower, this is Shadow Dancer. We are inbound with priority cargo and an injured pilot. Request priority landing clearance." There is a pause. Then the tower responds. "Shadow Dancer, confirm your mission number." Hayes looks at Ross. Ross shakes his head. Hayes says, "Bassingbourn, mission number is classified. Repeat, classified. We have OSS personnel on board with priority cargo. Request immediate clearance." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Shadow Dancer, stand by." Morrison says, "They are checking with someone." Chen says, "Who?" Morrison says, "Someone higher up the chain than tower control." 2 minutes pass. Then the radio crackles. A different voice. Older, authoritative. "Shadow Dancer, this is Colonel Hendricks. State the nature of your priority cargo." Ross moves to the radio, takes the handset from Hayes. He says, "Colonel, this is Major William Ross, OSS. My authorization code is Delta 79 or Charlie Foxtrot. The cargo is a high-value intelligence asset extracted from Axis-controlled territory. I need immediate clearance and a secure transport standing by." Silence. Then, "Major Ross, your authorization is confirmed. You are cleared for priority landing. Main runway. Emergency vehicles will be standing by. Do not deviate from approach. Ross says, understood. Shadow Dancer out. He hands the handset back to Hayes. Morrison says, they know who you are. Ross says, they know what I do. That is enough. Chen says, we are 5 miles out. I can see the field. Morrison cannot see the field. He can see a vague gray shape on the horizon. Maybe. Or maybe his brain is making it up. He says, Chen, you have the aircraft. Chen says, I have the aircraft. Morrison keeps his hands on the yoke, keeps his feet on the pedals, but he is not flying anymore. He is supporting, backing up, being the safety net in case something goes wrong. And for the first time since the hit, he feels a small, fragile sense of relief. They might actually make it. Then Kowalski says, contact, 2 o'clock high. Morrison's stomach drops. He says, say again? Kowalski says, aircraft, 2 o'clock high, closing fast. Chen says, is it one of ours? Kowalski stares. Then he says, I do not know. It is not. It does not look like anything I have seen. Ross is already moving. He is at the window, staring. And then he says something that makes everyone's blood freeze. He says, they followed us. Here is what happens in the next 90 seconds. Kowalski identifies the contact as a single aircraft. Not 3, just 1. Is moving at a speed that should not be possible. Chen estimates it is closing at over 400 miles per hour. In 1943, only a handful of experimental aircraft can do that. And none of them should be over the English Channel. Ross does not panic. He does not shout. He just says very calmly, get on the radio. Tell Bassingbourn we have hostile contact and we need fighter escort immediately. Hayes is already on it. He says, Bassingbourn Tower, Shadow Dancer is under attack. Repeat, we are under attack. Request immediate fighter support. The tower responds in seconds. Shadow Dancer, confirm hostile contact. Hayes says, confirmed, single aircraft, unknown type, closing fast. There is a brief pause. Then, Shadow Dancer, we are scrambling intercept. Hold your course. Do not deviate. Chen says, hold our course? We are a sitting duck. Morrison says, we hold course. We do not have fuel to maneuver. The aircraft closes to 2 miles. Then 1 mile. Kowalski is calling distance like a countdown. Half mile. Quarter mile. He is lining up. Morrison cannot see it. He can only feel it. The way you feel a predator behind you. The way your body knows something is wrong before your brain catches up. He says, Chen, when he shoots, you brake left, hard as you can. Chen says, that will burn fuel. Morrison says, do it anyway. The aircraft closes to 500 yards. Kowalski says, he is not firing. Why is he not firing? Ross says, because he does not want to destroy us. He wants to force us down. Morrison says, force us down where? Ross says, anywhere that is not Bassingbourn. And that is when Morrison understands. Whoever is flying that aircraft does not want them dead. They want them captured. Or they want the cargo captured. Either way, shooting them down over England would scatter the wreckage across farmland and bring every intelligence officer in the Royal Air Force running. But if Shadow Dancer is forced to land somewhere isolated, somewhere controlled, then the cargo disappears quietly. Morrison says, we do not land anywhere but Bassingbourn. Ross says, good. The hostile aircraft pulls alongside, not behind, alongside, close enough that Kowalski can see details. He says, I can see the cockpit, single pilot, no markings. The fuselage it is wrong. It is too smooth, too clean. Chen risks a glance. He says, that is not a Messerschmitt. That is not anything. The pilot in the hostile aircraft looks directly at Shadow Dancer, makes a gesture, a clear, deliberate signal. Follow me. Then the aircraft banks right and starts descending. Ross says, he wants us to follow him down. Morrison says, we do not follow him. Ross says, agreed. The hostile aircraft holds position for 10 seconds, waiting. When Shadow Dancer does not follow, the pilot makes another gesture. This time, it is not a request. It is a warning. Then the aircraft drops back, lines up behind them, and fires a single burst. Not at the aircraft. Past it. A tracer round that streaks across their nose close enough that Chen flinches. Hayes says, he is shooting at us. Morrison says, no, he is showing us he can. Ross says, where are those fighters? Hayes says, Tower says 2 minutes out. Morrison says, we do not have 2 minutes. The hostile aircraft fires again. This time the round hits. Not the fuselage, the tail. A precise shot that punches through the vertical stabilizer but does not compromise flight control. It is a message. I can put the next one wherever I want. Chen says, Jim, we have to do something. Morrison says, we hold course. Kowalski says, he is lining up again. And then something happens that no one expects. A voice comes over the radio. Not Bassingbourn Tower, not RAF control. A different frequency. A voice speaking clear, unaccented English. Shadow Dancer, you are carrying stolen property. Land immediately or I will disable your aircraft. Hayes looks at Ross. Ross looks at Morrison. Morrison says, who the hell is that? Ross says, do not respond. But Chen is already reaching for the handset. Morrison grabs his wrist. He says, do not. Chen says, why not? Morrison says, because the second we respond, we confirm we heard him. We confirm we understand. We give him leverage. Ross nods. He says, Morrison is right. Ignore it. This comes again. Shadow Dancer, this is your final warning. You have 10 seconds to comply. Hayes says, fighters are 1 minute out. Kowalski says, he is moving into firing position. Morrison makes a decision. He says, Chen, on my mark, you are going to drop flaps and cut power to 50%. We are going to slow down as fast as we can without stalling. Chen says, that will put him in front of us. Morrison says, that is the idea. Ross says, if he gets in front of us, he can shoot our engines. Morrison says, if he wanted to shoot our engines, he would have done it already. He wants us intact. So we are going to give him a problem he is not ready for. Chen says, this is insane. Morrison says, do you have a better idea? Chen does not. He says, on your mark. The hostile aircraft is 200 yards behind them. Locked in. Steady. Morrison counts in his head. 3, 2, 1. He says, mark. Chen slams the flaps down and pulls the throttle levers back. Shadow Dancer decelerates like someone hit the brakes. The airframe shudders. The nose dips. And the hostile aircraft, moving at over 300 miles per hour, shoots past them like they are standing still. For 5 seconds, the hostile is in front of them. Exposed. Vulnerable. And Morrison does something that makes absolutely no sense unless you understand what he is trying to do. He says, Kowalski, fire. Kowalski does not hesitate. He climbs into the top turret and opens up with the 50 caliber machine guns. Not at the aircraft, at the air in front of it. A wall of tracer fire that forces the hostile pilot to break left and dive to avoid it. By the time the hostile recovers and circles back, 2 RAF Spitfires are screaming in from the north. They see the hostile. They see Shadow Dancer. And they do not ask questions. They just engage. The hostile pilot makes one more pass. Close enough that Morrison can feel the pressure wave as it roars by. And then it is gone, climbing, banking, disappearing into the clouds before the Spitfires can get a lock. One of the Spitfire pilots comes over the radio. Shadow Dancer, this is Blue Leader. Hostile has broken contact. We are pursuing. Are you able to continue approach? Hayes says, affirmative. Shadow Dancer is continuing approach. Blue Leader says, copy. We will maintain escort until you are on the ground. And just like that, it is over. The hostile is gone. The Spitfires are flanking them. And Bassingbourn is 3 miles ahead. Chen says, we actually just did that. Morrison says, we are not down yet. Ross moves forward. He looks at Morrison, really looks at him, and he says, that was the smartest thing I have seen anyone do in the air. Morrison says, it was the only thing I could think of. Ross says, still counts. Hayes says, Shadow Dancer, Bassingbourn Tower has you on final approach. Runway is clear. You are cleared to land. Chen says, Jim, I am taking us in. Morrison says, you have the aircraft. Chen says, I have the aircraft. And for the first time since the hit, Morrison lets himself relax. Just slightly. Just enough to feel the pain in his head. The exhaustion in his hands. The weight of the last 2 hours pressing down on him like a physical thing. But he does not let go of the controls. Not yet. Because landing is still the hardest part. And Chen is about to do something Morrison is not sure he can do himself anymore. Chen is about to land a B-17 while Morrison flies half blind next to him. And if they get this wrong, all of it, the pickup, the attack, the evasion, the escort, all of it means nothing. Chen says, gear down. Kowalski says, Gear down and locked. Chen says, flaps 30. Kowalski says, flaps 30. Chen says, airspeed 120. Hayes says, 1 mile to threshold. Morrison can feel the descent. He can feel the angle changing, the airspeed bleeding off, the aircraft settling into the glide slope. But he cannot see any of it. He can only trust that Chen has it, that Hayes is feeding good information, that Kowalski is watching the gauges. He can only trust his crew. Chen says, half mile. Airspeed 1 to 10. Hayes says, you are on glide path. Looking good. Chen says, throttle back. Morrison pulls the throttle levers back, slowly, smoothly. The engine noise drops. The aircraft sinks. Chen says, very calmly, I have the runway. We are coming in. The runway is 8,000 feet of concrete, more than enough for a B-17 under normal conditions. But these are not normal conditions. Chen has never landed with an injured pilot sitting next to him, making phantom inputs. Morrison has never tried to support a landing he cannot see. And the entire crew knows that one miscommunication, one bad call, one moment of hesitation, and they turn into a fireball at the end of the runway. Chen's hands are steady on the yoke. His voice is steady when he speaks. But Morrison can hear it, the microscopic crack in his tone, the fear hiding just beneath the surface. Chen is 24 years old. He has 32 combat missions. He has landed this aircraft dozens of times. But he has never landed it like this, with a half-blind pilot, with mystery cargo, with OSS agents watching his every move, with the knowledge that if he screws this up, it will not just be his life, it will be 9 lives. Plus, whatever the hell this scientist knows that is worth killing for. Hayes says, 200 feet. Chen says, airspeed 100. Morrison keeps his hands loose on the yoke, keeps his feet light on the rudder pedals. He is not flying, he is shadowing, feeling for any deviation, any twitch, any sign that Chen is overcorrecting or undercorrecting. And so far, Chen is perfect. Hayes says, 100 feet. Chen says, throttle to idle. Morrison pulls the throttles all the way back. The engines drop to a whisper. The aircraft floats. And for one terrible second, Morrison thinks they are too high. That Chen misjudged the flare. That they are going to slam down hard enough to collapse the landing gear. But Chen holds it. He keeps the nose up, keeps the descent rate smooth. And Hayes says, 50 feet, 40, 30. Morrison can feel the ground now. Not see it. Feel it. The way the air pressure changes when you get close to a solid surface. The way the aircraft wants to settle. Chen is riding that edge, letting Shadow Dancer sink at exactly the right rate. Hayes says, 20 feet, 10. Chen says, hold it, hold it. And then the main wheels touch. Not a slam, not a bounce, a kiss. The aircraft settles onto the runway with barely a shudder. Chen holds the yoke back, keeping the tail wheel off the ground, letting the aircraft bleed speed. 5 seconds later, the tail wheel touches. Chen applies brakes, smooth, even. Minus the cresting problem, and Shadow Dancer rolls to a stop with 3,000 feet of runway still ahead. For a moment, no one speaks. The engines are idling, the props are spinning, and the crew is just sitting there, processing the fact that they are alive. Then Kowalski lets out a breath he has been holding for the last 2 minutes. He says, holy shit. Hayes says, we are down. Chen says, we are down. Morrison says, you did good, Chen. Chen does not respond immediately. His hands are still on the yoke, still gripping it like he is afraid to let go. Then he says, very quietly, I thought we were going to die. Morrison says, so did I. Ross is already moving. He is unbuckling. He is heading to the cargo bay. He is not wasting time on relief or celebration or any of the things normal people do when they survive something like this. He is working. Because for Ross, the mission is not over until the cargo is secure. Morrison tries to stand. His legs do not cooperate. The adrenaline is wearing off and the pain is flooding back in. His head feels like it is splitting open. His vision is worse than it was 10 minutes ago. He can barely see shapes now, just light and dark. Chen notices. He says, Jim, do not move. Medical is coming. Morrison says, I am fine. Chen says, you are not fine. You just flew half-blind for 2 hours. Sit down before you fall down. Morrison sits, not because Chen told him to, because his body is making the decision for him. He can hear footsteps outside the aircraft. Voices, the sound of vehicles pulling up, emergency crews, ground personnel. And then the hatch opens and someone climbs inside. It is not a medic. It is a man in a perfectly pressed uniform with enough ribbons on his chest to fill a textbook. He looks at Morrison, looks at Chen, looks at Ross, and he says, "Which one of you is Morrison?" Morrison raises his hand. Barely. He says, "That would be me, sir." The officer walks over, kneels down next to him, and Morrison realizes this is not just some colonel or general. This is someone with the kind of authority that makes OSS agents stand up straight. The officer says, "Lieutenant, I am General Cormac. I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. How much of that flight do you remember?" Morrison blinks, tries to process the question. He says, "All of it, sir." Cormac says, "That is unfortunate." Morrison says, "Sir?" Cormac says, "Because this mission never happened. The pickup never happened. The cargo never happened. And the attack you just survived definitely never happened. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Morrison understands. He says, "You want us to forget." Cormac says, "I want you to sign a document that says you will never speak of this flight to anyone. Not your family, not your friends, not other pilots, no one. In exchange, you and your crew will receive commendations, promotions, and a transfer to non-combat roles for the remainder of the war. You will be taken care of. But you will be silent." Chen says, "And if we refuse?" Cormac looks at him. His expression does not change. He says, "You will not refuse. It is not a threat. It is a statement of fact." Morrison can feel the weight of it, the enormity of what just happened. They did not just extract a scientist. They pulled off something that should have been impossible. And now the people who sent them are erasing it from history. Ross appears from the cargo bay. He has the scientist with him. The man looks exhausted, terrified, grateful. Ross hands him off to two other men in civilian clothes who immediately escort him off the aircraft. Ross watches them go. Then he turns to Morrison and says, "Thank you." Morrison says, "For what?" Ross says, "For not giving up. A lot of pilots would have bailed out. You did not." Morrison says, "I had a good crew." Ross says, "You had a great crew, and because of that, a lot of people are going to live who would have died. You will never know their names. You will never know how this plays out, but it matters. Trust me, it matters." Then Ross leaves, just like that. No salute, no handshake. He walks off the aircraft and disappears into the crowd of personnel outside. Morrison never sees him again. Cormac stands. He says, "Medics will take you to a private facility. You will be treated. You will recover. And when you are discharged, you will go home with an honorable record and a story you can never tell. I'm sorry, it has to be this way. But that is the world we live in." Morrison says, "What was he? The scientist?" Cormac pauses. Then he says, "Someone who knew too much, and someone we needed to know it instead." That is all he gives. Then he leaves too. And Morrison is left sitting in the cockpit of Shadow Dancer with his crew, trying to process what just happened. Hayes says, "Did we just get classified?" Chen says, "I think we did." Kowalski says, "Can they do that? Just erase a whole mission?" Morrison says, "Apparently they can." The medics arrive. They help Morrison off the aircraft. His legs are shaky. His vision is almost gone now, but he can still feel the ground under his feet. Solid. Real. Home. They load him into an ambulance. Chen climbs in with him. Hayes and Kowalski follow in a second vehicle, and as they drive away from the flight line, Morrison looks back at Shadow Dancer sitting on the tarmac. Ground crew are already swarming it, checking for damage, covering the holes, erasing the evidence. Chen says, "Jim, you good?" Morrison says, "I do not know." Chen says, "What they are asking us to do, keeping this quiet, is that even legal?" Morrison says, "I do not think legality matters when you are talking about this level of classification." Chen says, "So we just forget? We just pretend it did not happen?" Morrison says, "No, we remember. We just do not talk about it." Chen is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "You know what the worst part is?" Morrison says, "What?" Chen says, "We will never know if it was worth it. We will never know if that scientist actually changed anything. We will never know if we saved lives or just delayed something. We are just supposed to trust that it mattered." Morrison says, "Yeah." Chen says, "Does that bother you?" Morrison thinks about it. About the flight. The attack. About the landing. About everything that could have gone wrong and did not. And he says, "No, it does not bother me. Because we got the crew home. All of us. Whatever happens with the scientist, whatever happens with the war, we did our job. We brought everyone back. That is enough. Chen nods. He says, yeah, I guess it is. The ambulance pulls up to a building Morrison does not recognize. Not a hospital. Something else. Something unmarked. The medics open the doors and help him inside. And as they lead him down a hallway toward whatever comes next, Morrison realizes something. He is never going to fly again. His vision is gone. His career is over. And the one mission that would have made him a legend is the one mission he can never talk about. But he does not care. Because he brought his crew home. And in the end, that is the only thing that matters. 3 days later, Morrison wakes up in a room with no windows. The medical facility is somewhere in the English countryside. He does not know where exactly. Nobody will tell him. The doctors are polite but distant. They treat his injury. They run tests. They ask questions about his vision that he cannot answer because his vision is gone. Completely. Both eyes. The damage from whatever hit him was progressive. By the time they got him into surgery, it was too late. He is blind. Not temporarily. Not partially. Permanently. The doctor who delivers the news is a British ophthalmologist named Cartwright. He sits next to Morrison's bed and explains it in clinical terms. Optic nerve damage. Irreversible degeneration. Likely caused by some form of chemical or biological agent. They extracted fragments from the wound site, sent them for analysis. The results came back inconclusive, which is military speak for, we know what it is, but we are not going to tell you. Morrison listens to all of this without reacting. When Cartwright finishes, Morrison says, how long until I can leave? Cartwright says, you are not leaving, not for a while. Morrison says, why not? Cartwright says, because you are being kept under observation. Orders from above. Morrison says, how far above? Cartwright does not answer that. He just stands and leaves. And Morrison is alone again in his windowless room with nothing but his thoughts. Over the next week, the rest of the crew visits, one at a time, never together. Always supervised by someone in civilian clothes who sits in the corner and listens to every word. Chen comes first. He sits in the chair next to the bed and does not say anything for a long time. Then he says, they separated us. Different barracks, different schedules. I have not seen Hayes or Kowalski since we landed. Morrison says, they do not want us comparing stories. Chen says, we do not have stories. We signed the papers. We agreed to the terms. Morrison says, did you read what you signed? Chen says, not all of it. Did you? Morrison says, no. Chen laughs. It is a bitter sound. He says, we just handed over the rest of our lives, and we did not even read the contract. Morrison says, would it have mattered? Chen thinks about it. He says, probably not. They sit in silence. Then Chen says, they told me you lost your vision. Both eyes. Morrison says, yeah. Chen says, I am sorry. Morrison says, do not be. I am alive. That is more than a lot of guys get. Chen says, still, it is not fair. Morrison says, fair does not exist in war. Chen stands to leave. Before he goes, he says, Jim, whatever that scientist knew, whatever we carried, do you think it was worth it? Morrison says, ask me again in 10 years. Chen nods. Then he leaves. And Morrison is alone again. Hayes visits 2 days later. He brings news. The crew is being split up. Hayes is being reassigned to a training unit in Scotland. Kowalski is going to a maintenance depot in Wales. Chen is being sent to the Pacific Theater. And Morrison is being medically discharged with full honors. Hayes says, they are scattering us, making sure we do not talk. Morrison says, that is the idea. Hayes says, you know what I keep thinking about? That aircraft, the one that attacked us. I have been flying since 1941. I have seen every German plane in the Luftwaffe. That was not one of them. Morrison says, what do you think it was? Says, I think it was ours. Morrison goes still. He says, what? Hayes says, think about it. It did not shoot to kill. It shot to disable, to force us down. And it knew exactly where we were, exactly when we would be there. The only people who knew our route were the people who sent us. Morrison says, you are saying Ross set us up? Hayes says, I am saying someone did. Maybe Ross. Maybe someone above him. Maybe the whole thing was a test. Or maybe there are people on our side who did not want that scientist reaching Bassingbourn. Morrison says, that is a hell of an accusation. Hayes says, I know. That is why I am saying it to you and no one else. Because if I am right, then we were not just carrying cargo, we were bait. He leaves before Morrison can respond. And Morrison spends the next 2 hours lying in the dark, running through the mission in his head. The pickup, the attack, the escort, the landing, trying to see the shape of it, trying to understand if Hayes is right. And the worst part is, he cannot rule it out. Kowalski visits last. He is different from the others, more shaken, more angry. He sits down and immediately says, "They are lying to us." Morrison says, "About what?" Kowalski says, "Everything. I talked to a guy in the maintenance depot. He said they brought Shadow Dancer in for repairs. He said the damage pattern did not match standard enemy fire. He said it looked like someone put holes in the aircraft on purpose, in non-critical areas, like they were trying to make it look damaged without actually bringing it down." Morrison says, "Kowalski, you need to be careful what you say." Kowalski says, "Why? Because they will come after me? They already did. They already took our careers. They already took our stories. What else can they take?" Morrison says, "Your freedom, your life. Do not underestimate what they are capable of." Kowalski is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "Do you regret it, flying that mission?" Morrison says, "No." Kowalski says, "Even now? Even with everything that happened?" Morrison says, "I brought my crew home. That is all that matters." Kowalski says, "But we do not even know what we were protecting. We do not know if it made a difference. We do not know if any of it mattered." Morrison says, "We will never know. That is the deal we made, and we have to live with it." Kowalski stands. He says, "I do not know if I can." Morrison says, "You will, because you do not have a choice." Kowalski leaves, and Morrison never sees him again. 2 weeks later, Morrison is discharged. They give him a uniform, a medal he cannot see, a pension with a clause buried in the paperwork that says, if he ever speaks about the mission, the pension disappears. They set him up with veteran services, help him transition to civilian life, and they send him home to Ohio with a story that says he was injured in a training accident. His family believes it. His neighbors believe it. Everyone believes it. Because why would they not? But Morrison knows the truth. And the truth is this: he flew a mission that does not exist. He carried cargo that was never documented. He survived an attack by an aircraft that was never identified. And the only proof any of it happened is the fact that he can no longer see. For 40 years, he keeps the secret. He gets married, has kids, lives a quiet life. And every time someone asks him how he lost his vision, he tells them the same lie. Training accident. Bad luck. Nothing heroic. But in 1983, something changes. The government starts declassifying World War II documents. Not everything, just pieces. And buried in one of those releases is a reference to an OSS operation, codenamed Lazarus. Morrison's son finds it. He is a history teacher. He likes digging through archives. And when he sees the name Lazarus, he remembers something his father said once. A slip, a moment of weakness. Morrison had been drinking. It was late. And he said, "We used Protocol Lazarus once. I should not be alive." His son asks about it. Morrison refuses to talk. But his son keeps digging, and eventually he finds enough fragments to piece together a rough outline of what happened. A B-17 crew, an OSS extraction, a classified landing, and a pilot who flew half-blind. He shows Morrison the documents. Morrison reads them. Rather, someone reads them to him, and when they finish, Morrison is quiet for a long time. Then he says, "I need to write this down." His son says, "You signed papers. You are not supposed to talk about it." Morrison says, "I am 80 years old. What are they going to do? Arrest me?" So he writes, slowly, painfully, dictating to his son, filling in the gaps that the documents do not cover. The fear, the confusion, the way Chen landed the aircraft, the way Ross disappeared, the way the whole mission was erased. He finishes the diary in 1995, 2 years before he dies. And in the final entry, he writes something that his son will not fully understand until years later. He writes, "I saved the crew. But did I save the right thing?" Because Morrison spent 40 years wondering if Hayes was right, if the attack was staged, if the whole mission was a setup, if they were carrying something that was never supposed to reach Bassingbourn, or if they were carrying something so important that people on their own side were willing to kill to stop it. He never gets an answer. He dies in 1997, and the truth dies with him. But his son does not let it go. He keeps the diary. He keeps researching. And in 2015, he petitions for partial declassification. It takes 3 years, but eventually, the government releases a heavily redacted report that confirms the existence of Shadow Dancer, the existence of OSS involvement, and the existence of a mission that took place on August 17, 1943. What it does not confirm is what they were carrying, who attacked them, or why Morrison's injury was caused by a projectile of unknown composition that is still classified 80 years later. Those details remain locked away, hidden in files that may never see daylight. But here is what we do know. Shadow Dancer flew a mission that should not have succeeded. Morrison flew half-blind and brought his crew home. And somewhere in the chaos of World War II, 9 men protected something that was valuable enough to erase from history. Whether it was worth it, we will probably never know. But for Morrison, the answer was always simple. He brought his crew home. And that was enough. So what was really in that cargo bay? That is the question everyone wants answered. And it is the question that has no good answer. Just theories, speculation, and a whole lot of classified documents that might stay buried forever. But let me walk you through the possibilities. Because when you start pulling at the threads of this story, you realize it is not just about one mission. It is about a much larger web of covert operations, experimental programs, and secrets that the Allied powers did not want anyone to know about. Not even their own people. Theory 1. The Nazi defector. This is the official explanation, or at least the explanation that makes the most sense on paper. August 1943 is a turning point in the war. The Germans just lost at Kursk. Italy is about to surrender, and high-ranking Nazi officials are starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, they picked the wrong side. So, defections start happening. Scientists, engineers, intelligence officers, people who have information the Allies desperately need. Morrison's son found a reference in the declassified documents to a high-value technical asset being extracted from neutral territory. That fits. The Swiss border pickup, the OSS involvement, the extreme secrecy. If you are pulling a top Nazi scientist out of Europe, you do not broadcast it. You do it quietly. You erase the paper trail. And you make damn sure nobody knows where he ends up. But here is the problem with that theory. If it was just a defector, why the attack? The Nazis did not have aircraft that could intercept a B-17 over the English Channel in broad daylight without getting shredded by RAF fighters. And even if they did, why not just shoot the plane down? Why try to force it to land? Why fire warning shots instead of kill shots? Unless the people attacking Shadow Dancer were not Nazis at all. Theory 2. Stolen technology. 1943 is when the intelligence war starts heating up. Both sides are racing to develop superweapons. The Von rocket, the V2, jet engines, proximity fuses. Dozen other projects that do not make it into the history books because they fail or get canceled or stay classified for decades. What if the cargo was not a person? What if it was blueprints, prototypes, technical documents that the Germans were developing and the Allies managed to steal? That would explain the secrecy. It would explain why Ross had a satchel cuffed to his wrist. It would explain why the whole mission got erased. But it still does not explain the attack, or the projectile that hit Morrison. Because if you are trying to stop stolen technology from reaching Allied hands, you destroy it. You do not try to capture it. And you definitely do not use experimental weapons to do it. Which brings us to Theory 3. And this is where things get weird. The occult connection. I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like conspiracy theory nonsense. But here is the thing. The Nazi obsession with the occult is not a myth. It is documented. The Ahnenerbe, Himmler's expeditions to Tibet, the search for religious artifacts, the experiments with psychic phenomena. All of that happened. It is in the historical record. And the Allies had their own programs. Operation Paperclip is famous, but what most people do not know is that the OSS had a division that dealt specifically with, and I am quoting from a declassified memo here, non-conventional intelligence threats. That is code. Code for what, exactly, we do not know. But it suggests that the OSS was taking the Nazi occult programs seriously enough to counter them. So, what if the cargo was not a scientist? What if it was an artifact? Something the Nazis believed had power. Something the Allies wanted to keep out of their hands. That would explain why the mission was so heavily classified. It would explain why Ross disappeared after the landing. And it would explain why the projectile that hit Morrison was of unknown composition. Because if you are dealing with something that does not fit conventional military categories, you classify it in a way that makes it disappear. But that theory has problems too, because artifacts do not talk, and the declassified report specifically mentions interrogation protocols being applied after the cargo was secured, which means whatever they extracted from Switzerland, it was alive. It could communicate, and it had information worth protecting. Theory 4. Financial leverage. This one is simpler, less exciting, but maybe more realistic. What if the cargo was not a person or technology or an artifact? What if it was money, gold, bonds, financial instruments that could fund the rest of the war effort? Switzerland, in 1943, is the banking capital of Europe. Nazi officials are already moving assets out of Germany, preparing for the endgame. And the Allies know it. If you can intercept even a fraction of that wealth, you can fund operations. You can bribe officials. You can destabilize the Nazi economy. That would explain the Swiss border pickup. It would explain the secrecy. And it would explain why the mission got erased. Because financial warfare is not something you publicize. It is not heroic. It is not cinematic. It is just cold, hard economics. But it does not explain the attack. It does not explain the experimental aircraft. And it definitely does not explain why Morrison's injury was caused by something the military could not identify. Which brings us to Theory 5, the one nobody wants to talk about. What if the cargo was not from the war at all? What if Shadow Dancer was carrying something that predated the conflict? Something that had been hidden in Europe for years, decades, maybe longer. And what if the reason it was so heavily classified is because it did not fit into any existing framework? I am not talking about aliens. I am not talking about time travel. I am talking about something simpler and scarier. What if there are technologies, artifacts, or knowledge bases that exist outside the official historical narrative? Things that governments know about but do not acknowledge because acknowledging them would raise questions they cannot answer. There are precedents for this. The Antikythera mechanism. A device so advanced that when it was discovered, historians could not believe it was 2,000 years old. The Baghdad battery, the Voynich manuscript. Objects and documents that do not fit neatly into what we think we know about history. What if the Nazis found something like that? What if they were trying to weaponize it? And what if the Allies intervened to stop them? That would explain everything. The secrecy, the attack, the experimental aircraft, the unknown projectile, the lifelong classification. Because if you admit that something exists that should not exist, you open a door you cannot close. But here is the problem with all of these theories. They are just theories. We do not have proof. We have fragments, hints, redacted documents that raise more questions than they answer. What we do have is this: Morrison's diary, Hayes' suspicion that the attack came from Allied forces, Kowalski's observation about the damage pattern, and a government that has spent 80 years making sure nobody knows the full story. So, which theory is correct? I do not know. Maybe none of them. Maybe all of them. Maybe the truth is something so strange that even if I told you, you would not believe it. But here is what I do know. Shadow Dancer flew a mission that terrified the people in charge enough to erase it from history. Morrison flew half-blind and survived an injury that should not have been survivable. And whatever was in that cargo bay, it was valuable enough that someone tried to kill 9 men to stop it from reaching Allied hands. That cargo changed something. Maybe it changed the war. Maybe it changed what came after. Or maybe it is still sitting in a vault somewhere, waiting for the day when the world is ready to know what it really is. Until then, all we have are questions. And the knowledge that sometimes the most important moments in history are the ones they try the hardest to hide. Let me tell you why this story matters. And it is not because of the cargo. The cargo is a mystery. It will probably stay a mystery. And honestly, that is okay. Because the real lesson of Shadow Dancer is not about what they were carrying. It is about what happens when institutions decide that some truths are too dangerous to share. Morrison spent 40 years keeping a secret he did not fully understand. He signed papers that took away his right to talk about the most significant thing he ever did. And when he finally broke that silence, when he wrote his diary in the last years of his life, it was not because he wanted recognition. It was because he wanted someone, anyone, to know that it happened. That 9 men flew a mission that should have killed them. That they worked together under impossible conditions. That they made it home when every rational prediction said they would not. And that the only reward they got for it was silence. Think about that for a second. Morrison lost his vision, Chen got shipped to the Pacific, where he flew another 20 missions before the war ended. Hayes spent the rest of his career training pilots who would never know what he survived. Kowalski worked in a maintenance depot, fixing aircraft, while the mission he flew got scrubbed from the official record. And Ross? Ross disappeared. No post-war records, no pension documents, no death certificate. He just vanished like he was never there. That is what institutional secrecy does. It does not just hide information. It erases people. It takes moments of courage, sacrifice, and teamwork, and buries them so deep that even the people who lived through them start to doubt their own memories. But here is the thing. This is not just a World War II problem. This is happening right now. Today, there are missions being flown, operations being run, decisions being made that you will never hear about, not because they are not important, but because someone, somewhere, decided you do not need to know. And the people carrying out those missions, the ones putting their lives on the line, they are being told the same thing Morrison was told. Stay quiet. Do not ask questions. Trust that it matters. And maybe it does matter. Maybe there are secrets that need to stay secret. Maybe there is information so dangerous that releasing it would cause more harm than good. I am not naive enough to think that total transparency is always the right answer. But I also know this. You give institutions the power to classify anything they want, to bury any story they choose, to silence any witness who might talk. You create a system where accountability disappears, where mistakes never get corrected because they never get acknowledged, where the people in power can do whatever they want and call it national security. Morrison's story only came to light because his son refused to let it die, because he spent years digging through archives, filing FOIA requests, and piecing together fragments of a mission that was never supposed to be remembered. And even then, he only got part of the story. The rest is still locked away, still classified, still hidden. How many other stories are out there? How many other Morrisons are sitting in retirement homes right now, taking secrets to their graves because they are too afraid to talk? How many missions got erased? How many acts of courage went unrecognized because someone decided they were inconvenient? We will never know. That is the whole point. That is how the system works. But here is what we can do. We can tell the stories that do surface. We can honor the people who speak up even when it costs them. We can question the narrative when it does not make sense. And we can remember that history is not just what happened. It is what we are allowed to know happened. Morrison died in 1997. He was 80 years old. He spent the last 2 years of his life writing a diary that his family was not sure they could even publish. And in that diary, he asked a question that haunts me. He asked, "Did I save the right thing?" He never got an answer, and I do not think there is one, because the right thing depends on information he was never given. It depends on knowing what the cargo was, what it did, how it changed the war, or the world, or whatever came after. But I think Morrison was asking the wrong question. The question is not whether he saved the right thing. The question is whether the system that classified his mission, that erased his sacrifice, that silenced him for 40 years, is the right system. And I do not have an answer to that either. But I know this. Every time we let a story like Morrison's disappear without asking questions, we give that system more power. We validate the idea that some truths are too dangerous for ordinary people to handle. We accept that the people making life and death decisions do not owe us explanations. And maybe that is fine. Maybe that is the price of security. But maybe it is not. Maybe the cost of all that secrecy is higher than we think. Maybe we are losing something important every time we erase a story like Shadow Dancer from the record. I do not know. But I think it is worth asking. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to leave you with something. A challenge. Because if you made it this far, if you listened to this whole story, then you care about more than just entertainment. You care about the truth. Or at least, the parts of the truth we can still access. So here is what I want you to do. Talk to the veterans in your life, your grandfather, your uncle, your neighbor who served in Korea or Vietnam or Iraq. Ask them about the missions they do not talk about, the stories they keep to themselves. And when they tell you they cannot talk about it, do not push, but let them know you are listening. Let them know that if they ever want to share even a fragment, you will hear them. Because that is how these stories survive. Not through official channels, not through declassification processes that take 80 years, but through memory, through conversation, through the simple act of one person telling another person what really happened. Morrison's story survived because his son refused to let it die. Your family might have stories like that too. Stories that matter. Stories that got buried. Stories that deserve to be told. Find them. Preserve them. Share them. Because history is not what they let you read in textbooks. History is what people remember when the cameras are off and the official narrative does not make sense. And sometimes, the most important stories are the ones they tried the hardest to hide. Want more stories like this? Stories about the missions they do not teach in school, the moments that got classified, the people who did impossible things and never got credit? Then subscribe to World War II Uncovered. Hit the notification bell, because we are just getting started. Next time, we are talking about a B-24 that landed with no landing gear, no hydraulics, and no right to survive. The engineer came up with a solution so insane, so dangerous, that the Air Force classified it as tactically inadvisable for 50 years. They did not want anyone trying it again. But it worked. And the fact that it worked is why they buried it. I will see you then. And that is the story of Shadow Dancer, a mission that never existed, a crew that was told to forget, and a pilot who flew half-blind and brought everyone home. But here's the thing about stories like this. They do not end when the mission is over. They do not end when the papers get signed or the files get classified. They end when the last person who remembers stops caring. And I am betting you still care. Because you made it to the end. You listened to a 45-minute story about a flight that most people will never hear about. And that tells me something. It tells me you are not just here for the explosions and the dogfights and the Hollywood version of World War II. You are here for the truth. The messy, complicated, sometimes uncomfortable truth about what actually happened. And there is a lot more where this came from. See, Shadow Dancer is not unique. It is not some one-off anomaly. It is part of a pattern of missions that got erased, stories that got buried, and people who were told to stay silent. And the more you dig into the declassified archives, the more you realize how much of World War II we still do not know. So if you want more of this, if you want to keep exploring the parts of history they did not teach you in school, then do me a favor, subscribe to World War II Uncovered. Hit that notification bell, because we are building something here. A library of the forgotten, a collection of the stories that almost disappeared. And yeah, I know, everyone asks you to subscribe. Every channel, every video, it is always the same request. But here is why it matters for this channel specifically. These stories take time to research. They require digging through archives, cross-referencing documents, tracking down family members who might have diaries or letters or photos. It is not fast, it is not easy, and it only happens if enough people care. So, when you subscribe, you are not just getting notified about the next video. You are telling me that this work matters, that these stories deserve to be told, that the people who lived them deserve to be remembered. And trust me, the next story is worth remembering. It is about a B-24 Liberator. Tale number 42736, March 9th, 1944. The aircraft is coming back from a bombing run over Berlin. Everything is going fine until the landing gear fails. Complete hydraulic failure. No way to lower the wheels. No way to lock them in place. And the pilot, a guy named Captain Richard Howell, has two choices. He can order the crew to bail out and lose the aircraft. Or he can try to belly land a fully loaded bomber on a concrete runway at 120 miles per hour. He chooses option 3. His flight engineer, a sergeant named Marcus Webb, comes up with a plan. And it is so dangerous, so mechanically unsound, so completely against every safety protocol in the Air Force manual, that when they finally tried it and it worked, the military classified the whole incident. Not because it failed, because it succeeded. They did not want other crews getting ideas. The report said, and I'm quoting here, "While the action taken by Sergeant Webb resulted in successful aircraft recovery, the methodology is deemed tactically inadvisable and should not be replicated under any circumstances." Translation: it worked, but we are never letting anyone try it again. What did Webb do? I will tell you next time, but I will give you a hint. It involved a mechanic's tool, 60 feet of cargo straps, and a plan that should have killed everyone on board. It did not. They all walked away, and the aircraft flew again 3 weeks later. But you will never find it in the official records. Someone decided that some solutions are too dangerous to become standard procedure, even if they save lives. That is the next episode, and if you want to hear it, you know what to do. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, remember this. History is not what they wrote down. History is what people lived through. And sometimes, the most important moments are the ones they tried to erase. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never assume you know the whole story. I will see you next time on World War II Uncovered.